Hey, the last couple of weeks we've been in this series called Can't Even. This is our last week of it. And if you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to turn to the book of Matthew in chapter 5. We're going to be there in a couple of minutes, Matthew chapter 5. We talked about the first week of this series, just this feeling that I feel tired. And then last week we talked about this idea, I feel anxious. And today we're going to talk about this idea that I feel angry. So right before we jump in, I just want to point you towards some resources if you need them, inlandhills.com/resources. I recognize that for some of us, if we're really strongly dealing with feelings of exhaustion or languishing or anxiety or anger, while I think what we talk about today will be helpful, it's possible you need a little bit more. You may need to talk to someone. And if you go to inlandhills.com/resources, we've got suggestions on local counseling resources, mental health caregiver support, suicide prevention resources. This is a great place for you to go to lean more into this if you're feeling like you need to resolve some of this for yourself in the coming days. So I just wanted to point that to you. A friend of mine sent me an article yesterday in the New York Times. Here's the headline. 2 airlines will postpone serving alcohol amid surge of in-flight violence. American and Southwest announced the policies after the latest assault was captured on a widely watched video that showed a woman punching a flight attendant in the face. Okay, so this is real and this is happening. And if you've been out and about the last several weeks, you may not be so surprised about this. I've got friends who have been to baseball games, basketball games. I went to an 8-year-old basketball game, right? The rage that some people are feeling right now is just bubbling right beneath the surface. Why is that? A lot of reasons, but let's talk about the year we just exited that we're still, working our way through. The reality is, this last year, with a global pandemic and a total shift and change of the way that we lived our lives, and political tension and stress, and a continued erosion of our trust in one another, in community, and our trust even in our government, our institutions, like that continued to get whittled away by lots of things this last year. Really, no matter what your personal politics are, that probably was whittled away a little bit. We've all just been through a trauma. It's legitimately a trauma. And after you walk through something that is traumatic, you don't just snap back to the way things were before. So here's what's going to happen inside of you over the coming months. We're going to continue to open up more and more. The CDC is going to continue to, lower thresholds. It's going to feel like it did as far as the restaurants and theme parks and anything else. It's going to start feeling increasingly like it did back in early 2020 before the pandemic was a reality. And there's going to be a part of you then that's going to feel like, well, everything's back to normal. I should feel normal. What's wrong with me? But when you've walked through a trauma, you just don't snap back to normal quickly. And for some of us, we're going to have some residual PTSD or some residual anxiety or some residual anger in the weeks and months ahead of us. And if we know that going into it, that we've just experienced trauma, we've experienced grief, maybe you lost a loved one to COVID-19, or maybe you're just experiencing the grief of all of your routines being completely upended, like there's a likelihood that you're going to continue to walk through that. And so it's why people are right on edge with each other at the grocery store and at the baseball game and at the basketball game and on the airlines. There's been an uptick in drinking and an uptick in all kinds of things, right? So we have just walked through a difficult season. Jesus gives the greatest sermon I think ever delivered in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, his Sermon on the Mount. And after giving some introductory remarks to comfort those who need comfort, and to point toward the kingdom of God is what he's ultimately talking about, he begins to piece by piece take apart the things that we struggle with as people and as a society and talk about a better way forward in them. Here's what's fascinating about his sermon. Jesus starts with anger. He starts with anger. So what we're going to do today is look at Jesus' teaching on anger in Matthew chapter 5. And we're going to talk about what it actually means for us. But before we can do that, we need to talk about table flipping Jesus. Because anytime I talk about Jesus and anger, someone brings up, yeah, but Jesus flipped tables that one time in the temple. And so Jesus would also get angry and irrational and just outraged. And he would also do things. Like table flipping Jesus is the reason that lots of people feel justified to unleash their anger on the world in all kinds of unhealthy ways. Now, if you're newer to Christianity or you don't have a context for this, you may not know the story. And if you know the story, you may know it wrongly. So I thought we'd just take a moment before we jump into Matthew 5 to go and talk about table flipping Jesus, because for some of you, it would have been the thing in the back of your mind all day that would have permitted you to not listen to anything else I have to say. So let's have a discussion about table flipping Jesus, okay? Table flipping Jesus is the story of Jesus walking into the temple in Jerusalem. And what's been happening in the temple in Jerusalem is that there has been a sacrificial system that has been practiced by the Jews for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, when we, as 21st century people, think about an animal sacrificial system to God, that sounds completely barbaric and backwards to us. Of course it does. We live on the other side of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We live on the other side of the teachings of Jesus. So that stuff seems backwards because Jesus was the one who showed us a better way. But imagine how helpful an animal sacrificial system was to people in the first century. The question that they were struggling with as a people, the Jews, but also the other people surrounding, the other nations surrounding them, was how can we know for sure that we have peace with God? That was a troubling question. It led to all kinds of people just making desperate attempts to get God on their side or to get the gods on their side. Here comes this one true God, Yahweh, who says the exact way you can know that you can have peace with me is to do these things. Here's a whole list of them. You do these things and you can have peace with me. That, by the way, may seem barbaric to us, but it was a giant leap forward in consciousness for them. Oh, we can have peace with God. Here is the pathway by which we have peace with God. It was incredibly helpful for them. For hundreds of years, it was helpful. Then Jesus steps into the temple and takes on the sacrificial system that was incredibly helpful for them. Now, there's no doubt that Jesus is angry. Why? Well, some of the Jews have taken the sacrificial system that God intended to be very helpful for them, and they have figured out ways to profit from it. So they sell animals at the temple, but their price, the markup on the animals is really high. It's like when you return the car rental to the airport, and there's a gas station close to the airport, and whereas gas normally is $100,000 a gallon roughly in 2021, at the airport it's $150,000 a gallon, right? That's what you're stepping into. There's an upcharge. We know that we're the last gas station before you drop off your rental car, and we know you got to fill it up because the rental company is going to charge you millions of dollars per gallon. So come here, we'll only upcharge you by about 80% over what you normally pay, right? It's a great deal. So you go to that gas station. Well, this is what people had done at the temple. You need an animal to sacrifice so that you can have peace with God. You've come from a long ways away. You didn't carry your animal. We have animals for you, right? We're happy to sell you those animals for an upcharge. So Jesus is upset that people have used this helpful sacrificial system by which others knew they had peace with God in order to profit from. That's upsetting for him. So he walks into the temple and he sees that. And then he begins to do things. We're told that he flips over some of the tables of the money changers and their money just goes everywhere. He releases some of the animals, so there are animals just running around the temple getting out. He creates a whip and starts whipping it in the air to drive the animals and the people out. Oh my gosh, table flipping Jesus is crazy. Like, look at what all damage he's doing. Like, oh my goodness. And so someone gets angry because the person in front of them at the supermarket used a check, like wrote a whole check. Took 3 minutes to write a check when they checked out. Like, who even used, I've never even seen a checkbook in my life except in the movies. And someone used a checkbook to check out, and it took forever, and everybody's waiting on me, and I've got to get home and start cooking dinner. Well, you know what table flipping Jesus would do? He'd yell at that person. That's what he'd do. That's what I'm going to do. So you just start feeling justified. Well, Jesus was angry, and he showed his rage. I'm angry. I should be able to show my rage. There is a world of difference between what Jesus does at the temple and what you do at the supermarket. Here's what Jesus does at the temple. In flipping the tables over, and in letting the animals free, and in basically crushing the system for a moment, the sacrificial system where the blood has been spilled and poured out every day, day after day, for hundreds and hundreds of years, comes to a stop. And in Jesus' actions, he foreshadows what's about to come. That I'm going to go to Golgotha. I'm going to go to the cross. I'm going to let them hang me on that cross. I'm going to let them take my life from me. And then I'm going to raise from the dead, and you will never have to sacrifice an animal again to know that you have peace with God. See, human beings, we'd walked away from God, who is our life source. And in doing so, we started hurtling down a pathway toward death. You can't keep living when you abandon your life source. And so Jesus steps in and he takes the death that we were hurtling toward upon himself. He takes it into himself. He allows it to kill him, and then he defeats it by raising from the dead. This creates a pathway for us to come back to God. And we no longer need the sacrificial system to know that we can have peace, because Jesus was willing to lay his life down to create a pathway once and for all. and in flipping over the tables at the temple and in putting a halt, a stop, a temporary, momentary stop to the sacrificial system that had been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, Jesus is foreshadowing a better way that's to come. In other words, yes, Jesus was angry, but Jesus was also on mission. Jesus took his anger and he integrated it. Jesus took his anger and he pointed it in a particular direction to be helpful, to start foreshadowing the solution to a problem. He didn't just walk in and in a rage lose his mind and lose control. Jesus was very controlled and very calculated about how he used his anger. So when you think about table flipping Jesus, don't think of an angry madman who lost it for a moment. Think of someone who used their anger and pointed it in the right direction to be helpful to millions and millions and billions of people. That's what Jesus did when he flipped tables. So Jesus starts in his greatest sermon in Matthew chapter 5 by talking about anger. Why? Because anger ends up being the root of all kinds of evil in our lives. Anger is simply unmet expectations plus fear. That's what anger is. So you expected one thing, you got something different, but also there was fear involved in that. Now, depending on the circumstances, that could be fear of all kinds of things. Sometimes it's fear of inadequacy, right? I expected someone to treat me with some respect, but they didn't, and now I'm afraid that I'm inadequate. Or I expected for things to go this way, and they went that way. And now I'm afraid of what the future holds because it seemed certain, but now it seems less certain. Or I thought that I stood someplace with somebody, but now I'm starting to reconsider whether that's true because they didn't do what I thought they would do relationally. Or I feel like I'm being ganged up on or bullied at work, and I feel like increasingly people are trying to approach me in tyrannical ways, and I'm not sure how to get out of it, and I'm afraid then of what the future holds. There can be all kinds of reasons that you are afraid, but anger is some kind of unmet expectation plus fear. That's what it is. And so Jesus addresses anger first. I want to skip down a few verses to see where he's going to go with this, and then I want to skip back up to see how he got there, because this is kind of how he ends one of these sections. He says this: if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. All right, well, that doesn't seem like that big a deal unless you have a little bit of the context for it. The Jewish people had seen themselves as being God's people, sent to this promised land. And therefore, this was our land. God guaranteed that this would be our land. But then they were disobedient. They walked away from God. And God, to punish them, just removes his hand of protection. And they get conquered by the Babylonians and the Assyrians and later the Greeks and the Romans. And so for about 400 years, the Jews have lived underneath the rule of someone else. So by the time Jesus comes around in the 1st century, the Jewish people have been living under Roman rule for a long time, and they are furious, bitter about living under Roman rule. It'd be like if our greatest enemy, the Canadians, came across the border. And they came down here with their hockey and their poutine and their maple syrup, and they were like, we're in charge now. We're setting the rules. Obviously, Canadians would never do this. They're way too polite, but let's pretend that they would for a moment. And then suddenly, they're in charge of us. Now, that might seem a little bit humorous, but what if a few years ago, when ISIS was at their peak of power, what if they had just continued to grow? What if ISIS had grown so much that they were able to invade the United States, and they're bringing in a totally different understanding of religion, and they're forcing all of us to live underneath their rule? What if that happened? You'd be furious, and you'd be angry, and you'd be afraid because you wouldn't be in control, you wouldn't be in charge, and someone else is bringing in foreign ideas and forcing you to live underneath them. That's how Israel feels in the 1st century. Their enemies are ruling over them. Their enemies are setting the agenda, and while they've been allowed some amount of societal freedom to worship their God and to make some kind of a living, at the end of the day, there is no doubt who's in charge, and it is Rome. And one of the rules that they had in the 1st century was that a Roman soldier was allowed to ask a citizen to carry their pack for them for up to a mile. The packs that Roman soldiers carried were between 50 and 70 pounds. They were very heavy. And so since the soldier didn't want to wear themselves out, carry that all day, they could ask a Jewish person to do it for them, and the Jewish person was obligated to do it underneath the law. So when Jesus gets to 5:41 and says, if they ask you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles, you need to understand what he's pointing to is, if your greatest enemy, whom you despise and want to see overthrown, if that person who you are legally bound to carry their pack for a mile, if they ask you to do it, carry it too. Well, that was a huge thing to ask and would have been very upsetting. He doesn't start there, though. He starts by talking about anger. Why? Because you're furious about the circumstances that you find yourself in here. And if you haven't dealt with your anger, this is impossible to do. So Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse number 21. This is how Jesus begins. You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Now, this is already a difficult teaching to start off with. Like, you know what? Jesus says, Moses told you not to murder people. And you feel pretty pompous and pretty proud about the fact that you don't murder people. You're like, oh, yeah, I may hate my brother. I may curse him in my mind. I have tons of anger for him, but I don't murder him. I'm a good person. I'm righteous because I haven't murdered anybody. I'm doing pretty well. I mean, this is a really low bar, guys, right? This is a really low bar. I've seen people absolutely lose it in public several times the last couple months. Haven't seen anyone murder someone in the checkout line yet. So most of us are doing pretty well with the, like, don't murder thing, right? Jesus says, you think you're proud of yourself. You think you're prideful. Like you're measuring up to the standard of holiness that God has set for you because you don't murder people. Well done. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Well, Jesus, that doesn't feel fair. I was doing great with the not murdering thing. But now you don't want me to even be angry? That doesn't feel right. Like, just to be angry at a brother? Like, what if he does something that makes me angry? Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. Anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Raka, by the way, was like in the first century, was kind of like a first century way of like flipping someone the bird. Raka. It's just an angry thing. So, someone cut you off in traffic with their chariot. And you just Raka, right? There weren't a lot of chariots at that point. But you get what I'm saying? Or you fool, like put in whatever expletive you use when someone cuts you off in traffic here. And this is what we're talking about. Yelling at someone for doing something that's stupid, calling them an idiot, calling them whatever name you feel like you need to call them when they cut you off. This is what he's talking about. And that puts you in danger of the fire of hell. It's like, Jesus, that feels really extreme. But see, what Jesus is pointing to is not just the action. In fact, it's not even primarily the action of yelling Raka or calling someone a fool. It's the heart that gets you to that point. It's the anger in your heart to where your first reaction is to yell something hateful at someone. See, that anger is corrosive. That anger is destructive. And that anger doesn't put you on a pathway of life. It puts you on a pathway of destruction. And so Jesus rightly points out the fact that while these are just symptoms, they put you in danger. He continues, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. This, by the way, would have felt completely absurd to people listening to him. He is giving this message in Galilee. Galilee is a 3-day journey from Jerusalem. So for his hearers, what he's saying is, if you travel 3 days to get to the temple in Jerusalem, and as you approach God with your sacrifice, this would have been a live animal that the priest is going to kill for you. When you approach God with your sacrifice, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave the animal, the live goat or pigeon or whatever, leave it there, walk 3 days back to Galilee, make sure that you make everything right, walk 3 days back to the temple, hope that the goat is still alive and has not been stolen, and then make your sacrifice. It's ridiculous. But this is how important it is to deal with the anger and the resentment that's in our heart. And so this is how Jesus is pushing them to think. That the more resentment you have, the farther you are from God. It's not possible to hold that kind of animosity in your heart and to live a Godward life. So we skip down to verse 38. He's going to give some real hard teachings here that are going to give some concrete to these abstract thoughts. Here's what he says. You've heard that it was said eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Now, eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, that was easy to comprehend. That was easy to understand. Oh, you hurt me, therefore I have the right to hurt you just as much. And it was a limiting principle when this was first given, because what would happen is you hurt me to the 10th degree, I now have the right to hurt you to the 20th degree. So this was actually a giant leap forward for them when they were first received it. If someone hurts you, you can hurt them back exactly as much as they hurt you, but not more. and as barbaric as that may seem, that was a limiting principle still. This, by the way, is also the principle that my 2 children live with. Dad, he started it. He was the first one to hit me, so I should get to saw his leg off. Like, that seems to be an appropriate punishment to me, right? So that is often where we go. It is a emotional and moral development that's pretty low. But that was what God was working with when he first came to be with the Israelites. And so he was helping them limit it. So you've heard eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And you can just imagine the crowd being like, yeah, get him. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Say what? Yeah, let me give you a few examples. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Now, as you read this, you may start to think, okay, but that's completely ridiculous. So what, Jesus, like the way to follow after Christ then is to just be a holy doormat for other people to walk on? The way to follow after Jesus is just to refuse to ever retaliate at all, to just lay myself down, to just let evil be evil and let them just overcome me. Is that what he's saying? And see, it would sound that way to us because we're missing some major cultural context here of precisely what Jesus is inviting us to do. So I want to talk through each of these 3 examples and help us see them the way that a first century person would have understood them. Because Jesus is not asking you to just push your anger down and just let people walk over you. That's not what he's asking. So to help me out with this, I've invited my good friend and one of our church board members, Dave Wiles. Can everybody welcome Dave Wiles to the platform real fast? And I want to talk about, especially with Dave, this first example. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also, okay? So, Dave, hold up your left arm. Your left arm. There you go. Okay, this is Dave's left arm. Now, if Dave were living in the first century, Dave would only use this left arm for one thing, wiping his booty. That's what you use your left hand for in the first century. So then, if everybody knows that you're using your left hand to wipe your bottom, and there aren't hand sanitizer stations scattered every 5 feet, what do you want to avoid doing with your left hand? Anything. Anything but that, right? So you don't shake someone's hand with your left. That would be very offensive if you stuck out your left hand to welcome someone. Like, whew, no, get that away from me, right? That's gross. So you just don't use it for anything else. That's what you use your left hand for. So if you're going to punch someone, if you're going to slap someone, if you're going to shake someone's hand, if you're going to greet someone, you don't do it with your left hand, you do it with your right hand. Okay, so if Dave was upset with me and he wanted to punch me, he wanted to assault me, he would be using his right arm. So, Dave, go ahead and, right here, right? This is, yep. A very hearty, yeah, no, that was great. Okay, so, all right, so if you punch me, go ahead and put it right here again. So which one of my cheeks is Dave hitting when he punches? My left, right. But what does the passage say? If anyone slaps you on the right cheek. All right, so he's not talking about the left cheek, he's talking about the right one. If Dave's going to use his right arm, but he's going to hit my right cheek, how's he going to have to do it? He can't punch me. What's he going to have to do? Backhand me, right? So this is what Jesus is pointing to. If I punch someone in the face with my left hand, sorry, that was really dirty, right? If I punch someone in the face, I am saying, like, obviously I'm angry with you, but also we are on equal ground. I punched you. Like, we are equals. If I slap someone, if I backhand someone, we're not equals. I'm saying you're not even worthy of me punching you with a closed fist. Like, I'm saying I am better than you, greater than you in the social power hierarchy. And so the way you would slap people, the people you could slap backhanded like that were people who were considered property. And this isn't good, but this was a first century Roman understanding. It was women, and it was children, and it was slaves, and it was people who were below you in the social structure. You could backhand those people, and that was considered fine by society. But if you backhanded someone who you were supposed to, it meant that you did not see them as an equal. And so what Jesus is saying is if someone slaps you, go ahead, do it again, on your right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. See, now he can't really slap this cheek. He can't backhand it because it's in front of him. Instead, he has to punch. He has to punch me in this cheek. Go ahead and do that again. Yep, perfect. So he's got to punch me. What I've done right now is incredibly subversive. Without using violence at all, I have forced Dave to treat me like an equal. So Jesus says, you may be angry, you may be furious. Take that anger, turn the other cheek, force them to treat you as an equal, and in doing so, you will upset them. You will throw them off. In fact, you may shame them to the degree that they just have to walk away. Walk away, Dave. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it, my friend. So this is what Jesus is teaching them. He's not saying lay down and be a carpet. He's saying, no, force them to come face to face with what they're doing to you. Turn the other cheek also. If they want to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. There was a great wealth disparity in the first century. And so a lot of times the people with the most wealth would lend to people, obviously, with the least wealth. And oftentimes they would charge absurd interest rates to lend money, 40, 60, 70% interest rate. So what would often happen is someone would they'd just run out. They just couldn't make their payments anymore. You were legally allowed to sue that person for everything they had except for their coat. You could take their home, you could take their money, you could take their possessions, you could take every stitch of clothing that they had except their coat. Because it was believed like, well, you got to keep your coat. They have to have something to sleep in, something to protect you from the elements. You got to keep something. And so you couldn't sue for the coat, but you could sue for everything else. So Jesus is basically recalling for their minds this idea that someone with a lot of power is treating someone with far less power in an inhumane and indignant way. And it says, and if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, they would only take your shirt if it was the last thing you had left. So you were on your last leg here. Hand over your coat as well. Well, your coat was the very last thing you had. So if you give them your shirt and then you take your coat off and hand that over as well, what are you now wearing? Nothing. You are standing in front of them stark, completely nude. We're not going to demonstrate that this morning. You're welcome. But that would be the case. You would just be standing completely naked in front of them. In the first century, the one who sees the nakedness is the one who is shamed, not the one who is naked. So you are, in taking your coat off and handing it, you are shaming the person who has sued you to this point. And then think of the picture, like you're in court, you hand it over, you're now naked. Now you're walking back to your home or the place where you're residing completely naked. You're walking through the streets completely naked. And people are like, whoa, 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 what's happening? And everywhere you walk, people necessarily tell the story, oh, that guy down the street sued him for everything, so he just gave him his coat also. And like, oh, the shame is on the guy who sued you for everything. Without being violent at all, Jesus says, take your anger, your righteous indignation, and funnel it in a subversive way that forces people to see the shameful thing that they've done. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. But Jesus, it is not fair. It is not fair that we have to live under Roman law. It is not fair that these centurions who are not looking out for my best interests come around and get to tell me to carry their heavy pack, interrupt my workday, my schedule, and tell me to walk it a mile. You're right, it's not fair. So don't walk it a mile. Walk it 2. You see, the first mile is the law. You have to do that. The second mile is grace. I can't force you to do it. In fact, you may make the soldier nervous that you walk at a second mile. What if they tell my supervisor? What if they tell other people that I made them carry it too? Like in their nervousness, they also are forced to see the shame of what they're asking you to do. The first mile, you have to do it. The second mile, you get to do it. Don't walk it 1. Walk it 2. You're not supposed to be a doormat. You're not supposed to just press your anger down and suppress it so that you can look like the kind of person who's got it put together and who is gracious and kind. You're supposed to take the anger that you feel, which you cannot help. Of course you will feel anger sometimes, and you are supposed to funnel that anger into a healthy way to subvert the thing that caused that anger. In other words, Jesus invites us to integrate our anger. So a way to do this, I just want to give us a quick way to do this. And then we'll talk a little bit about being unoffendable, and then we'll be done. Notice your resentment. If you're the kind of person that you have felt angry, by the way, just because you don't explode in the supermarket aisle or in traffic or at a baseball game doesn't mean you're not feeling angry. In fact, some of the angriest people I've ever met in my life are the people you'd least expect it, because they've convinced themselves the best way for them to live is to repress that anger publicly so that no one ever sees it. Sometimes they're not even very in touch with it themselves, and then you get them talking about something that they're feeling resentful about, and it just starts to just boil over and explode. So just because you're not outwardly angry towards someone doesn't mean you don't have anger that's gripped your heart. Doesn't mean you're not wishing the worst for some people. So notice your resentment. There are tons of things that we might be resentful over. Make your own list. It could be women, or it could be men, or it could be the patriarchy, or it could be left-wing politics, or right-wing politics, or politicians, or it could be natural disasters. It's not fair that people get sick, or that people lose their homes, or that all this stuff seems to be happening in the world. It could be our own inadequacies, like we just feel bad about that. It could be our bad parents, or our perceived bad parents. We could make a list 100 miles long as to what some of the resentments might be. But notice your resentments. write them down. I would encourage you, set aside half an hour. What am I feeling angry about? You know what? There are some things that you may be feeling angry about that are not within your control. If you're mad about who's in some elected office somewhere, that election's over. You don't have a lot you can do till the next one. Like don't let that eat you up inside. But there are many, many things within your domain of power that you can fix. If you're feeling bullied at work, for instance, by your supervisor, do you have to just let them continue to do that? Is that what you have to do? Or can you put your resume together? Make it awesome. Look for some other places to work. Record what it is that they've done to you. Actually go and talk to them about it or to their supervisor about it at some time. Have an escape plan to go to something else, a different job, maybe a better job somewhere else. See, like a lot of times the reason that people end up going for psychotherapy is they haven't learned to be assertive. They've got all this anger roiling inside of them, but they've never figured out how to be assertive with it and to handle it and to channel it into something good and productive that can actually stop the thing that's making them angry over and over again. So my encouragement would be to write down your resentments, recognize what they are, think through what are some creative ways that you can channel your anger to get out of the situation that's causing you resentment, or to change the situation that's causing you resentment, to be creative like Jesus asked us to with our own anger, to maybe subvert the norm, to call attention to something that should be shameful. So notice your resentment. Also recognize this: we are really quick to judge others and give ourselves a pass. We are really quick to just say, you know what, that guy's an idiot. Even in traffic, I'll just say a couple weeks ago, I was pulling out of the subdivision that we live in, and I'm just about to turn right. And right as I'm about to turn, this bicycle comes out of nowhere and just zoom, and I almost like pulled out and into the bicycle. And I thought to myself, like, that guy should have looked. Like, that guy's an idiot. I could have heard him. A week later, I'm riding my bicycle. I'm going past the same place where I was in a car earlier. And I look at the guy, and he's turning exactly where I was going to turn when I was in the car a week before that. And I look at it, and I say out loud to myself, look at me, look at me, look at me, right? I want him to notice that I'm going. And I think he does, because he stops. And so I think, okay, he's good. So I go, and then he starts to pull out and almost hits me. And I think to myself, that guy's an idiot. So whether I'm the one in the car or the one on the bike, whoever I'm not, that guy's an idiot, right? That's how this goes. Why? We are so willing to give ourselves a pass on things because we know our intentions, we know our heart, and we project on other people something else. So it is the fact that the other guy is always the jerk. The other guy is always the jerk because I am always the victim. We all have a natural tendency to do that. That's just how it goes. And so to recognize our natural tendency to play the victim and to cast upon other people that they're the problem, notice your resentment, but recognize the possibility that you're not seeing the situation clearly and that you're not assuming the best of others. Try to think what that would look like. Because the reality is, taking offense is a national sport. We are offended all the time. We find everything to be offended about. And let me just say that Christians are not better at this than other people. In fact, we might be worse. I grew up in a fairly traditional church, and I remember there was so much to love about that church. They pointed me to Jesus. They pointed me to a different way to live. I have people invested in me as a kid and as a teenager. Like, I have so much love for that church that I grew up in. But one thing I do remember growing up is that we always had an enemy, someone we were mad at. And it was the producers in Hollywood, or it was the politician who got elected, or it was the infringement, the perceived infringement on our religious rights or whatever. There was always an enemy. There was always someone who was upsetting us, always someone who was offensive, always someone who wasn't yelling, "Merry Christmas," loud enough for us. We were always offended by something. We were offended all the time. It was exhausting. And so we always had this low degree of frustration and anger built in toward people who were outside of the church, who we felt were trying to somehow tread on our ability to worship God. Here's what actually happened. Can I just tell you what real was? Here's what was real. Christianity had, in most of the 20th century, a place of privilege within the American culture because most people in America identified as Christian. Increasingly, by the end of the 20th century, and certainly in the last 20 years, more and more people walked away from any kind of faith at all, and that meant mostly Christianity lost, which means more people weren't Christians than people who were. And so the place of privilege that Christianity once had, it no longer had. And that upset us a lot because we liked having a place of privilege. So we understood a loss of privilege to be persecution, which is not the same thing. So then we were offended by everything because, we lost privilege in the society. The culture doesn't treat us fair. They're upset with, they don't like us. They don't treat us fair. We're offended at everything then. Taking offense is a national sport, and it's happening a ton in our churches. We're just offended by everything. Compare that to 1 Corinthians 5, where the Apostle Paul, one of the first followers of Jesus, who wrote a huge chunk of our New Testament, says this: "What business is it of mine to judge those outside of the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you." He's saying this because they had someone who was a follower of Jesus who would not repent of their sin. He's like, okay, that person you got to deal with. They're held to a different standard. But what business is it mine to judge those outside the church? That politician you're furious with, that movie star that you're angry with, that guy at your place of employment that doesn't seem to give your faith the kind of place of privilege in his mind that you wish he would. Like, what business is it of ours to judge those people? I don't expect people who aren't following Jesus to behave as if they are following Jesus. And Paul says the same. And so I'm not going to get offended. I'm not going to constantly be angry by people acting the way that they do if they're not followers of Jesus Christ. See, I can start to convince myself that everyone else is guilty, everyone else is subpar, everyone else is a jerk or an idiot, and I'm the only one that's not. The scriptures call this having a deceptive heart. And here's the key: my heart isn't deceptive because it fools other people, but because it fools me. I convince myself that I'm always in the right. And then I'm upset and angry all the time. Here's the reality: the only opinion we are to have about non-Christians is that they are infinitely loved by God. That's the only opinion we're supposed to have. But Josh, they did something wrong that really upset me. Righteous indignation, table flipping Jesus. Like, yes, I get it. How can you take that resentment, that anger you might have, and channel it into helpful ways of confronting them with the pain that they've caused? Helpfully. Not irrationally, not out of control, helpfully. But Josh, that gives them more grace than they deserve. They don't deserve for me to have that kind of grace. Well, exactly, because grace isn't for the deserving. Grace is for those who need grace. People like you. People like me. You see, at the heart of the gospel is this realization that whatever someone else does, I've done worse. The Apostle Paul who started churches all over the Mediterranean, and has been probably one of the most singularly influential Christians in all of Christian history, wrote that there was no greater sinner than him. That's quite a thing. Grace isn't for the deserving. Grace is for me. Grace is for you, and therefore grace is for the people who upset you. So I want us to think through our anger and resentment and recognize that as we continue to walk down that path, it continues to trouble our hearts. My son Jack was born, and 18 months later, he was diagnosed with autism. And then my wife and I had to decide, okay, what are we going to do about having a second child? When we first got married, my wife Emily wanted to have 4 kids because we hadn't had any, and we didn't know what a pain they were. And so she was like, 4. And I was like, well, maybe 2. And then we had 1, and I was like, well, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And she was like, this is a lot harder. And I was like, well, what about we stick with 1 and like a dog? What if I even got you a cat on top of that? Which is, to me, inviting a cat into my household is the same of opening my door to the spawn of Satan. I really have to feel very flexible to do that. And I was whatever you want. If we could just keep the 1 kid and then add some amount of animals, maybe that would be fine. But no, she really wanted a second child. And so I got to a place where I did not handle that conversation or the decision that followed it very well. I decided that if we didn't have a second child, she would probably get resentful of me. And so I thought, well, I should probably be the one to flex on this to Ben. But instead of working that out together in a helpful conversation, I just basically said, fine, we'll have a second child. I think my words might have been nicer than that, but inside it was basically like, whatever, fine. And then I started to withdraw over the next several months. She had a really difficult pregnancy. And then we had a scare with William as he was in the womb, and that I'll tell you about some other time. It was challenging. And right up until his birth, like we were increasingly disconnected from one another as a couple. We'd been married almost 13 years at that point. And we'd never really had a huge blowout, huge spat. We'd obviously had disagreements. There had been times where financially we were super challenged, but we'd never had this like huge blowout. And we just were increasingly distant from one another in a way we'd never been before leading up to his birth. And I was getting angry. And I was getting resentful because she wasn't doing some things I thought she should do. And she was getting angry. And she was getting resentful because I wasn't doing some things she thought I should do. But we never talked about it. It was passive-aggressive down to the core. There was no communication. We were just going through the motions, basically being married for a few months there, and that was toxic. And eventually, a couple of months after William was born, we sat down for the first of what became many conversations where we just put it all out on the table. Here's what I'm feeling. And when you did this or when you didn't do this, this is what it felt like to me. I didn't know that. I'm sorry. I can shift that. Here's what I'm feeling. And when you did this or you didn't do that, here's what it felt like to me. And we just had to talk it out. We had to take our anger and our resentment, and instead of using it to stab each other, which is what you'll be tempted to do, we had to corral it in creative ways and use it to be honest with each other. Far harder, far more difficult. But healing took place over the next several months and years. And then after that, our marriage was stronger than it had ever been before. Jesus invites us not to live in our anger and our resentment. You can't help that you get angry sometimes. But what you do with that anger matters. And the world around you can be more or less positive because of how you channel that anger. And the same reason you should turn the other cheek and hand over your coat and walk that second mile and have that hard conversation with your spouse at the dinner table should lead you to resolve the anger in every other part of your life. Don't allow it to take hold because it'll block you from being the blessing that you've been created to be for the world around you. So we're going to sing a song of worship in just a moment. The band's going to come and we're going to sing together. And then we thought it'd be fun to give you some opportunities to channel your anger maybe in more helpful and creative ways. So out in the lobby, off to this side, there's a huge whack-a-mole game, and we would love for you to go out there and play that. We put cupcakes and cake out in the lobby because it's really hard to be angry with a mouthful of cake, so we thought maybe that would be helpful today. And then we've got like one of those giant strongman hammer competitions where you can take it and try to hit the bell up top, and you should do that. Whether you hit it to the top or not, it might just feel good to get some aggression out. And then once you've done that this afternoon, you feel like, yeah, that felt nice. Maybe later tonight, or tomorrow, or this week, you sit the person down you need to talk with, and you have the hard conversation you need to have. Our hope is that you work through it well. And the invitation of Jesus is not to hold on to the bitterness, the anger, the resentment, but to, in creative ways, channel it and let it go. Father, thank you for our time together today. Lord, we recognize that there are some things that we are just upset about. They are difficult to walk through. And in the midst of all of it, God, we invite you to help us resolve it in creative ways, to channel what we're feeling in ways that are helpful to others and helpful to ourselves and therefore helpful to the world around us. It's in Jesus' name we pray.